She moved her fireplace, and no one thought it mattered. In the winter of 1881, in a quiet stretch of Montana Territory near the Bitterroot Valley, people believed there were only two ways to survive the cold. You either burned more wood, or you froze. Every cabin in the valley followed the same design. Thick log walls, a stone chimney, and a fireplace set squarely in the middle of one wall, just like it had always been done. It was familiar. It was trusted. And it was terribly inefficient. No one questioned it, because questioning it meant questioning everything they had been taught about survival. Sarah Hendricks lived in one of those cabins. It sat at the edge of the valley where the wind came down hardest from the mountains. Her husband Michael had built it with his own hands years earlier. The logs were tight, the roof was sound, and the foundation was solid. But by the spring of 1881, Michael was gone. A falling branch during a logging job ended his life without warning. Sarah was left alone with two children, 9-year-old Emma and 6-year-old Joseph, and a cabin that suddenly felt much too large and much too cold. Summer gave her time to think. And worry. And calculate. Michael had split a good supply of firewood the previous fall, but even before summer was half over, Sarah realized it would never last through winter. The old fireplace devoured wood. Heat blasted outward for a few feet, then vanished straight up the chimney. The back corners of the cabin stayed cold no matter how hard the fire burned. With Michael gone, Sarah would have to cut, haul, and split wood herself while also tending the children, the garden, and the animals. If she followed the same routine as everyone else, winter would break her. One evening, as she sat watching the flames climb uselessly upward, she noticed how little warmth actually stayed in the room. The fire was loud and bright, yet the floor near the walls remained cold. Smoke sometimes pushed back into the room when the wind shifted, making the children cough. It struck her then that the fireplace wasn't failing because the fire was weak. It was failing because the design was wrong. Sarah had grown up in Vermont in a stone house built by her father, who had been a mason. She remembered how their home stayed warm long after the fire died down. She remembered stone walls that felt warm to the touch even on the coldest nights. Their fireplace had been built into a corner, not the middle of a wall. At the time, she had never questioned it. As a child, warmth was simply something that existed. But now, with winter approaching and no margin for error, those memories returned with clarity. In July, when the ground was dry and the days were long, Sarah made a decision that shocked her neighbors. She began tearing down her fireplace. Not repairing it. Not adjusting it. She dismantled it completely, stone by stone, stacking the materials carefully outside the cabin. People riding past slowed their horses to stare. A widow destroying her only source of heat made no sense to them. Some said grief had clouded her judgment. Others said she must be desperate. Sarah didn't explain herself. She worked quietly, methodically, pulling down the old design that wasted heat and replacing it with something older and smarter. She rebuilt the fireplace in the southeast corner of the cabin, where two walls met at a right angle. Instead of facing straight out, she angled the firebox at 45 degrees so the heat pushed into both walls at once. She used dense sandstone hauled from the creek bed, heavy rock that absorbed heat slowly and released it just as slowly. She extended the stone deep into the walls, turning that corner of the cabin into a massive heat storage system. Nearly 3,000 pounds of stone went into that structure. The chimney ran upward inside the cabin instead of along the exterior wall, allowing every inch of it to give off warmth. She kept it shorter than usual so less heat escaped before it could be used. Every joint was sealed tightly. Every angle was deliberate. When she lit the first fire in late September, the difference was immediate. The flames burned cleanly. The draft was strong. Within an hour, the entire cabin felt warm, not just the space in front of the hearth. Emma and Joseph played on the floor in the far corner without sweaters. The stone absorbed the fire's energy, holding it quietly like water in a deep well. As autumn faded and winter arrived early, Sarah noticed something else. Her woodpile shrank slowly. While other families fed their fires constantly, she built a strong fire in the morning, let it burn down, and trusted the stone to do its work. Hours later, the cabin was still warm. At night, she added fuel once more, then slept without fear that the cold would creep in before dawn. Her neighbors assumed she was freezing. Smoke barely rose from her chimney. It looked as though she wasn't burning enough to survive. But when they stepped inside, they felt it immediately. Not the sharp heat of a roaring fire, but a deep, even warmth that filled the room. The walls themselves felt alive with stored heat. When January arrived, the valley faced one of the coldest winters in living memory. Temperatures dropped far below zero. Snow piled against cabin walls. Wood ran out faster than expected. Families burned green wood out of desperation, filling their homes with smoke while still shivering in the corners. Children slept in layers of clothing, frost forming on blankets near the walls. Sarah's cabin stayed warm. During the worst blizzard, a neighbor came to check on her, expecting to find her struggling. Instead, he found children playing on the floor in rolled-up sleeves and a fire burning calmly instead of roaring. Thermometers were brought in. Measurements were taken. The results stunned everyone. Sarah's cabin held steady at 68 degrees throughout the room. Other cabins barely reached 40 near the fire and hovered near freezing elsewhere. The difference was 55 degrees. The men who built cabins for a living stood in silence as the numbers confirmed what their bodies already felt. This wasn't luck. It wasn't better wood. It wasn't a smaller space. It was design. The corner fireplace worked with physics instead of against it. It heated stone instead of air. It spread warmth evenly instead of blasting it in one direction. It turned the entire cabin into part of the heating system. Word spread quickly. By spring, other families were tearing down their center wall fireplaces and rebuilding them in corners. The following winter, those cabins used less wood, stayed warmer, and kept children healthy. No one named the method after Sarah. No one wrote it down at first. It didn't need a name. It just worked. Sarah lived quietly the rest of her life. She raised her children. She helped neighbors who asked. She never claimed credit. But long after her fireplace was no longer considered unusual, its lesson remained. Heat doesn't belong in the air. Air forgets warmth. Stone remembers it. Geometry matters. Placement matters. And sometimes, survival doesn't require more effort, just better understanding. She didn't fight the winter. She listened to it. And by moving one fireplace to a corner, she kept her cabin 55 degrees warmer all winter, not through force, but through wisdom that had been waiting to be remembered. The winter eventually loosened its grip on Bitterroot Valley, but it did not release its lessons. When the snow began to melt and the creek swelled with runoff, people did not forget what they had seen inside Sarah Hendrick's cabin. The cold had tested every family equally, and the results were impossible to ignore. Some cabins had survived through exhaustion and constant labor. One had survived through understanding. That difference stayed with people long after the last frost faded from the ground. As spring turned the valley brown and then green, men began talking differently about heat. Before, they talked about how much wood a man could cut, how big a fire he could keep burning, how long he could stay awake feeding it through the night. Now they talked about stone, about placement, about angles and airflow, about why some heat stayed and some vanished. The conversation had shifted from strength to design. Jacob Brennan was the first to act. His family had survived the winter, but barely. His children still coughed in the mornings, and his woodpile was nearly gone. As soon as the ground thawed enough to dig, he dismantled his old fireplace. It felt wrong at first, like tearing out the heart of the cabin. But he remembered the warmth in Sarah's home. He remembered touching her walls and feeling heat where none should have existed. He followed her measurements exactly, even when it meant more work than he was used to. Other families followed. Some watched at first, skeptical but curious. Others helped, carrying stone, mixing mortar, asking questions. The work was slow and heavy, but it felt purposeful. Every stone added to the corner felt like insurance against another brutal winter. By summer's end, several cabins in the valley had corner fireplaces built with deep stone mass, angled fireboxes, and interior chimneys. When the next winter came, it did not arrive gently. It was not as cruel as the year before, but it was cold enough to remind everyone what failure felt like. This time, the valley told a different story. Fires burned lower. Woodpiles lasted longer. Cabins stayed warm through the night without constant tending. Children slept away from the hearth without freezing. Smoke no longer hung thick inside homes from desperate burning. People began to understand something deeper than warmth. They understood that the old way had demanded constant struggle because it wasted effort. It fought the cold every minute instead of preparing for it in advance. The corner fireplace didn't fight the cold. It absorbed heat when it was available and gave it back slowly, patiently, the way the earth does after a summer day. Builders began changing how they thought about their craft. William Hackett, who had built cabins for decades, admitted quietly to other carpenters that he had been copying tradition without questioning it. He started sketching new layouts, planning cabins around the fireplace instead of adding it as an afterthought. The hearth became part of the structure, not just an opening in the wall. Stonemasons found renewed respect for their trade. Stone was no longer just something solid to stack. It was something alive with potential. Its weight mattered. Its density mattered. Where it touched the living space mattered. Masonry was no longer about holding a building up. It was about keeping a family alive. Sarah never stood at the center of these conversations. She listened when asked. She explained when invited. But she returned each evening to her quiet routine. She built her fires in the morning and before bed. She watched her children grow stronger through winters that no longer frightened her. She trusted the stone to do what it had always done. Years passed. New families arrived in the valley. Some built their cabins with corner fireplaces from the beginning, never knowing it had once been considered strange. Others learned after their first winter, the hard way, just as Sarah had. The knowledge spread outward, carried by word of mouth, by experience, by the undeniable comfort of a warm room when the world outside tried to kill you. By the time Montana became a state, the corner fireplace was no longer unusual. It was simply smart. Manuals began to mention it. Builders taught it to apprentices. Homesteaders passing through the valley took the idea with them to Idaho, Wyoming, and beyond. The design changed slightly over time, but the principles remained untouched. Heat stored in mass lasts longer than heat trapped in air. Geometry guides warmth. Stone remembers. Sarah lived long enough to see her children build homes of their own. Each one had a fireplace set into a corner, angled just right, backed by thick stone. She visited those homes in winter and felt the same quiet warmth she had created years earlier out of necessity. She never spoke about that first winter unless asked. There was no pride in it for her. Only relief. When she died, there were no speeches about innovation. No plaques. No recognition beyond a few quiet words among neighbors who understood. But on cold nights, when fires burned low and cabins stayed warm, her legacy was present in every stone that held heat instead of letting it escape. The lesson remained simple. Survival does not always belong to the strongest fire or the biggest effort. Sometimes it belongs to the person who notices where the heat goes and asks why. Sometimes moving something a few feet, changing an angle, or trusting old knowledge is enough to turn suffering into safety. And long after Sarah was gone, stone continued to do what it had always done. It absorbed warmth. It held it. And it gave it back slowly, through long winter nights, to families who never knew her name but slept comfortably because she once paid attention to what the cold was trying to teach. Years passed, and the valley slowly forgot what life had felt like before the corner fireplaces became common. New families arrived and built their cabins with stone already planned into the corners, never questioning why it was done that way. To them, a warm house in winter was normal. They did not remember the nights when frost formed on blankets or when children slept in coats indoors. Comfort became invisible once it was reliable, but the old-timers remembered. They remembered waking every hour to feed a fire that never seemed to give enough back. They remembered the sound of wind finding its way through cold corners and the fear that came with realizing the woodpile was shrinking too fast. When they sat near their new corner hearths, feeling heat seep gently from stone long after the flames had faded, they understood the difference between noise and effectiveness. A roaring fire looked powerful, but it was the quiet warmth that kept people alive. As the years went on, the design spread beyond Bitterroot Valley. Travelers carried the idea with them, not as a named invention, but as a simple truth. They told others that stone mattered. That corners mattered. That fire should heat walls, not just air. In places where winters were cruel and fuel was precious, people listened. They always do when survival is involved. Builders began adapting the idea to different landscapes. In areas where sandstone was scarce, they used granite or basalt. In forests with softer stone, they increased mass to compensate. Some cabins added benches built directly into the stonework so people could sit against the warmth. Others extended the chimney mass further into the living space. The details changed, but the principle stayed the same. Heat stored is heat saved. Sarah watched all of this from a distance. She did not travel or teach formally. She stayed on her land, tending her garden, raising animals, and watching her children grow into adults who understood cold without fearing it. Her fireplace remained unchanged, still doing its quiet work each winter. The stone had darkened slightly with age, polished smooth by years of absorbed warmth. It felt alive in winter, like something breathing slowly. Emma grew into a thoughtful young woman who loved books and numbers. Joseph became strong and practical, comfortable with tools and stone. Both understood the fireplace not as something magical, but as something logical. Sarah had taught them that warmth was not about burning harder, but about wasting less. That lesson followed them into everything they did. When Emma married and moved to a neighboring valley, her new home was built with a corner hearth from the start. Joseph built his own cabin nearby, placing the fireplace carefully, measuring angles the way his mother had taught him. The knowledge had become part of the family, passed quietly, without ceremony. As time moved forward and technology changed, other heating methods appeared. Coal stoves, iron furnaces, later oil and gas systems. Many people moved away from fireplaces entirely. In towns and cities, warmth came from pipes and vents, controlled by knobs instead of flame. Fire became something decorative rather than essential. But in rural areas, and especially in places far from reliable supply lines, the old wisdom never fully disappeared. Whenever storms knocked out fuel deliveries or power lines failed, people returned to what worked without outside help. Fire, stone, gravity, airflow. The same forces Sarah had trusted decades earlier. Modern homesteaders, living off-grid by choice or necessity, rediscovered the same truths through trial and error. Many of them arrived at corner fireplaces the hard way, after wasting fuel and effort fighting designs that lost heat faster than they could produce it. Some found old books. Others learned from elders. A few stumbled across diagrams drawn long ago by builders who had once stood in Sarah's cabin with thermometers in their hands, stunned by the numbers. Over and over, the conclusion was the same. Thermal mass mattered more than flame size. Placement mattered more than tradition. By the early 20th century, building manuals began to describe these principles more formally. Words like convection, radiation, and heat retention entered the language. Engineers explained mathematically what Sarah had understood intuitively. That stone absorbed energy and released it slowly. That warm air rose and cooled air fell. That geometry shaped movement. But even with equations, the truth remained simple. The corner fireplace worked because it respected how heat behaved. Sarah did not live to see central heating become common. But she lived long enough to know that her decision had mattered. She lived long enough to hear neighbors talk about warm winters without fear. She lived long enough to see children grow up healthier, winters become manageable instead of terrifying, and woodpiles last longer than expected. When she passed away quietly in her sleep, the fire in her hearth had burned low. The stone still held warmth from the evening before. The cabin was comfortable, even in the early morning chill. It was fitting. The stone that had protected her family for decades continued doing its job without her. Time moved on. Cabins became houses. Houses became towns. People forgot names and stories. But the physics did not change. Heat still behaved the same way it always had. Stone still remembered warmth. Air still forgot it quickly. Corners still offered the best place to anchor mass and guide circulation. In the modern world, with thermostats and sensors and automated systems, the lesson can feel distant. But whenever systems fail, whenever power goes out, whenever supply chains break, people are reminded that comfort is not guaranteed by complexity. It is guaranteed by understanding. There are still cabins today, far from cities, where fires burn quietly in corners, backed by tons of stone. In those places, winter nights are long and silent. Snow piles high outside. Wind rattles trees and howls across open land. Inside, the fire dies down, and the stone takes over. Walls give off warmth. Floors stay comfortable. People sleep through the night without waking to tend flames. Those people may never have heard of Sarah Hendricks. They do not need to. Her contribution was never about recognition. It was about survival. About noticing waste and correcting it. About trusting knowledge older than fashion. The story of her fireplace is not really about fireplaces at all. It is about paying attention. About asking why something works the way it does. About having the courage to change a trusted design when evidence shows it fails. About understanding that tradition is only useful when it serves reality. She moved her fireplace, and in doing so, she changed how heat lived in her home. She turned stone into a memory keeper. She turned geometry into protection. She turned a desperate situation into a lasting solution, and the cold, relentless, and unforgiving, taught her the lesson the only way it ever does. By punishing waste. By rewarding understanding. By caring nothing for habit or pride, that lesson is still there, waiting. In stone. In fire. In corners where heat gathers instead of escaping. Waiting for anyone willing to listen. The years that followed carried that lesson even farther, quietly and without ceremony. As roads improved and people traveled more freely between valleys, the way cabins were heated became something discussed in passing, mentioned at trading posts and church gatherings, shared the way practical knowledge always is. Someone would mention how little wood they burned the previous winter, or how their home stayed warm even after the fire died, and the explanation would always return to the same simple idea. The fireplace was in the corner, built heavy with stone, designed to hold heat instead of losing it. No one spoke of innovation. They spoke of relief. In time, the design reached places far harsher than Bitterroot Valley. In high mountain settlements and northern plains where winter ruled more than half the year, the corner hearth proved itself again and again. Where fuel was scarce and labor was costly, the difference between burning constantly and burning wisely meant survival. Families learned that the goal was not to fight the cold every minute, but to prepare for it in advance, storing warmth the way one stored food or water. Even as newer heating methods appeared, some people chose to keep the old ways. Not because they rejected progress, but because they understood resilience. A system that required no wires, no deliveries, and no moving parts could not fail all at once. Fire, stone, and gravity would always be available. In uncertain times, that knowledge brought comfort no machine could replace. Children who grew up in those warm cabins carried the memory with them. They remembered walls that felt alive in winter, floors that stayed warm through the night, and homes that never smelled of smoke or panic. When they built their own houses, many chose the same design, not because it was taught in books, but because it had worked for their parents and grandparents. The knowledge moved forward through lived experience, not instruction. Long after Sarah's name faded from conversation, her understanding remained embedded in stone across the land. Every quiet winter night in a warm cabin carried a trace of her choice. Not as a story told aloud, but as a steady warmth felt in the bones. And that was always the point. The best wisdom does not announce itself. It simply keeps people alive, season after season, while the cold passes harmlessly outside.